Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone. In the whispering winds of the Appalachian foothills, and deep in the tropical canopies of Jamaica's Blue Mountains, an ancient faith moved quietly among people in chains and in flight. It did not shout from pulpits or emerge from grand synagogues, but instead lived in the sacred hush of oral tradition, in songs passed through generations, in the peculiar customs of the free and the fugitive. It was not always called Judaism or Hebrewism by its practitioners, but its roots reached back to ancient Israel, and its presence was felt in the lives of Black Maroons and runaway slaves who dared to believe that the God of Abraham also heard their cries. This is the untold story of how Hebrew traditions found fertile ground in the rebellious enclaves of the Maroons and along the hidden routes of the Underground Railroad, an echo of Zion in the wilderness of the West. Long before the transatlantic slave trade brutalized West African societies and scattered millions of souls across the Americas, there had already been a cross-pollination of Jewish and African spiritual beliefs. Jewish diaspora communities had settled in parts of North and West Africa, including Ethiopia, Mali, Senegal, and the Old Ghana Empire, influencing local traditions. When European powers began raiding and colonizing Africa, they often captured individuals from ethnic groups already practicing forms of Hebraic customs, whether through contact with the Maghrebi Jews, the Igbo of Nigeria, some of whom identified as descendants of Israelites, or through the Judaic-leaning elements of Songhai and Mali's religious elite. These people, sold into slavery, carried not just memories and trauma, but sacred worldviews that would refuse to die. As enslaved Africans reached the Americas, many were dispersed into brutal plantation systems from the southern United States to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean. Yet wherever they were forced, rebellion was never far behind. In the dense jungles and mountains of Jamaica, Haiti, Suriname, and Cuba, some enslaved people escaped and formed free societies known as Maroons. These communities, built by fierce warriors, spiritual leaders, and visionaries, were often multi-ethnic, but they preserve a strong African identity and a spiritual foundation deeply tied to resistance, morality, and divine justice. Within some of these Maroon societies, traces of Hebrew customs emerged, practiced not always in textbook form, but in deeply encoded cultural practices. Jamaican Maroons, for example, especially those of the Windward communities like the Nanny Town Warriors, were documented to have observed sacred rest days and upheld dietary restrictions that were reminiscent of Old Testament laws. British colonial reports during the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes noted with curiosity the Mosaic laws observed by some of these Maroons, including abstention from pork, ritual cleanliness practices, and specific mourning rites. These behaviors may have been rooted in African spiritual systems with similar features, but oral traditions and later Afro-Jamaican religious sects such as the Bedouinites and later the Rastafarians kept alive narratives of ancient Israelite descent. On the mainland, in the American South, enslaved African Americans likewise nurtured quiet remnants of Hebrew tradition. For some, this manifested through direct transmission from African-born elders. For others, it emerged through their own interpretations of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. This was the age of invisible churches, secret religious gatherings in the woods where enslaved people interpreted Scripture through the lens of their suffering and resistance. Moses, Pharaoh, and the Exodus story were not just biblical tales. They were political manifestos, lived experiences, and prophecy. They resonated so powerfully because many of the enslaved people saw themselves quite literally as Israelites in exile. When the Underground Railroad began to take form in the early 19th century, it was not just a system of physical escape, but a sacred journey that fused faith and freedom. Conductors and passengers alike spoke the language of Zion, Canaan, and Jericho. The spirituals sung during these clandestine travels were saturated with Hebraic references. Songs like Go Down, Moses, Wade in the Water, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot were more than metaphors. They were coded theologies born from a synthesis of African cosmology and Hebrew scripture. Harriet Tubman herself was often referred to as the Black Moses, a title that recognized her not only as a liberator, but as a prophetic figure walking in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets.
Moreover, some fugitive slave communities that settled in the northern states or Canada began adopting more structured expressions of Hebrew identity. Among them were groups influenced by earlier waves of Black Jews and Hebrew Christians in the American colonies, many of whom traced their roots to African Jews in Portugal, Spain, or North Africa. These identities were nurtured in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and parts of upstate New York, where Black religious leaders began to openly claim Israelite descent. Some African American churches in the mid to late 1800s transitioned into assemblies that focused almost entirely on Old Testament teachings, Sabbath observance, kosher-like dietary laws, and the belief that Black people were the true Hebrews of the Bible. This spiritual reawakening did not happen in a vacuum. Early Black leaders such as Bishop William Saunders Crowdy, founder of the Church of God and Saints of Christ in 1896, have been influenced by both Hebrewic visions and Underground Railroad theology. Crowdy claimed divine revelation that Black Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel and established one of the first organized Black Hebrew congregations in America. His church, along with others like the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, would later draw upon the spiritual legacy that had existed, albeit informally, within the Maroon communities and Underground Railroad networks. In Suriname and Brazil, similar patterns emerged. The Jamaican Maroons of Suriname, for example, retained practices that involved circumcision, a form of monotheistic worship, and a rejection of certain impure foods. Dutch and Portuguese colonial observers often noted these habits and speculated about their Jewish origins. In fact, some of the escaped slaves who helped form these Maroon societies had been owned by Sephardic Jews who had themselves fled the Inquisition and settled in the Caribbean and northern South America. The enslaved Africans, in turn, adopted some of the religious customs of their Jewish masters, but often reinterpreted them through African lenses, blending them with ancestral rites and symbols. Thus, the Hebrewism that developed among Maroons and Underground Railroad communities was neither uniform nor always doctrinal. It was adaptive, organic, and resilient. It was passed through story, song, ritual, and resistance. Whether through sacred rest days in the hills of Jamaica, coded hymns on the trail to Canada, or dietary laws in a Saramaka jungle hut, the spiritual fingerprints of ancient Israel could be traced like hidden inscriptions carved into the soul of Black resistance. This tradition did not fade into obscurity. Its influence can be seen in modern movements like the Hebrew Israelite congregations across the U.S., the revivalist practices of certain Jamaican Rastafari mansions, and even in elements of African American gospel and civil rights preaching. The fire that burned in the Maroon enclaves and the underground sanctuary still flickers in Black communities, seeking both spiritual identity and historical truth. Hebrewism among Maroons and Underground Railroad communities is a chapter often neglected in mainstream histories of both Judaism and Black America. Yet it offers a compelling window into the syncretic genius of oppressed peoples who, despite persecution and erasure, managed to preserve fragments of ancient faiths and breathe them anew into the quest for freedom. Their story is not just about theology. It is about survival, prophecy, and the enduring belief that the God who parted the Red Sea would one day break every chain.